Life, culture and current events from a biblical perspective. 2020 with Neil Johnson on Vision.
As we do on a Tuesday, we'd like to link in with Alex Cook, our Ask Alex segment. Our talkback line is open on 1800 316 316. Alex, special welcome back to 2020.
Thanks, Neil. Great to be with you again today.
Alex, it almost sounds a little sensationalist if we ask that question, is chaos coming? And we might think it's a black and white response, a yes or a no, but let's perhaps, if we're going to address this, perhaps let's talk about a biblical insight into what we might be feeling, because sometimes people are fearful of a future if they believe chaos is coming. I wonder if you've got some insights here into a biblical foundation of how you might approach difficult times.
Look, absolutely. So look, I like to start when we talk about, the future and so forth, we should look at that in a very humble sense, because the truth is none of us know the future. We certainly know when you read the book of Revelation, it does look pretty chaotic when you see that. However, there's different interpretations as to how that will play out. But if we look at it from an economic perspective, there's two fabulous Bible verses that I like to quote, because I think they really give us a useful way of thinking about money and economics. So the first one is from Proverbs, and what it says is a sensible man watches for problems ahead and prepares to meet them. The simpleton never looks and suffers the consequences. And then the second one, which may appear slightly contradictory, says, since no one knows the future, who can tell someone else is what is to come? And that's from Ecclesiastes chapter 8. Now, on face value, they may appear to be contradictory, but I don't think they are. I think the reality is that, as I say, no one knows the future. I can't tell listeners what the stock market's going to do today or tomorrow or the next week. It's just impossible to predict. However, a sensible man looks for problems ahead, and I know on your program you're dealing with a lot of the cultural issues. There's the same thing with economics. We can see certain things that at some point have to bite. And the one that we've been warning about for years is the level of debt. And at some point, you reap what you sow. You have to pay the debt back. And so that's what I would call, a long-term problem that is really obvious. And a sensible man can then make decisions as to how they're going to navigate that environment. But we need to have that sort of humble view and pray for God for wisdom and discernment, because we just don't know exactly how these things are going to play out and in what time frame. So that's sort of a bit of a thinking, I guess, from a biblical perspective. And be careful who you listen to, obviously.
Well, as you say,
including
be careful
me.
who you listen to, and that's a humbling thing to say, including me. In other words, check a lot of different sources. But the interesting thing is, if you are reading the financial pages, you might get one perspective on the economic climate from one economist, and you might get a different idea from another. Somehow or other, you do tend to take sides the more you read. But your thoughts on who you might trust when it comes to not just those biblical foundations, which I think are trustworthy, but those other things that we're always looking at surrounding the economic environment.
Yeah, so in terms of who you trust, and you're right, you need to be careful because, I think when you read things like the newspaper and so forth, you have to ask, how are these organisations making their money? And the majority of them make their money through advertising, whether it's a newspaper, etc. And the biggest funders of advertising are the banking and property sectors. You see housing advertised for sale, you see banks, etc. And so naturally, they're not going to do things and release commentary that's going to have a negative effect on their business. So these companies are worried about outflows, when money leaves them. And so they're generally going to paint a fairly positive picture. Get the occasional sort of big doom and gloom from left field, but for the most part, they're fairly biased. And I think, no, it's not necessarily sinister, it's just the way the system's wired, if you like. So you do need to be very careful and discerning. So what I personally do is I read very widely, and I try and read economists that are independent. They're not relating to a large financial institution, because I think that way you can try and get a bit more clarity and then try and reach your own conclusion. And as I say, pray for wisdom. I'm stewarding clients' capital. I want to make sure that I'm going to do that as best best I can, and I pray for God for help regularly, because you do need that in this economic climate that we find ourselves in.
We might be asking, is chaos coming? But I guess what you can settle on is that things are becoming a lot more volatile, given the post-COVID environment. Any thoughts on how you might look at things, not only our Australian setting, but around the world, because those things affect us as well?
Yeah, look, a couple of things that I would draw people's attention to. So volatility, so when I talk about volatility, I mean the fluctuation in share prices, etc., also the bond market, all of that has really accelerated this year. You do expect markets to be, bounce around in general. But for example, last week the US put out their inflation figures, and it came in slightly higher expected. And when I say slightly, I mean very slightly, 0.1%. But because it was not what the market expected, the stock market fell 4% in a single night, which is a very large fall. It's one of the biggest falls since the GFC, so quite a significant fall. And so the market seems to me to be now getting a lot more jittery about what's going on in the real economy. So this is starting to get more problematic. But then what we're also witnessing around the world, particularly in Europe, is energy costs have exploded. So, for example, I read a fascinating article the other day saying the average electricity cost in the UK was going to be £3,900 per household, which is probably about $8,000. So, yet the average household in the UK only earns just over £40,000. So you're talking about 10% of a household budget going in energy costs at least. So that's a huge pressure, and of course they're going into winter there. And so that's going to have a big flow on economic impact. But probably the bigger issue other than just households is all the small businesses, that require electricity to function all day, whether it's their air conditioning or just, their equipment. And so this is a real issue. I think the energy crisis in Europe, if I was a betting man, and I'm not a betting man, if I was, I think Europe could be if you like, the source of the next crisis. If I was to, Germany is this massive industrialized economy. I think it's the fifth in the world. And, now you've got Russia switching off their gas. That, to me, could have a huge flow-on effect to these large industrialized economies like Germany. And you could see a GFC-style event, because at the end of the day, energy is one of your essentials for, the functioning of civilization. And so it is a real problem when it gets this expensive. And there's all sorts of legislation now getting passed in the UK and places like that to try and cap it. But I'm not sure how easy it is to control, as politicians like to think. But we live in this era now where politicians feel, because they're under so much pressure, they have to do something. And sometimes that can make things worse. So I think the environment is just getting less and less predictable. I mean, I would say the future in one sense has always been uncertain, but it's getting less and less predictable. And of course, you're seeing a massive political polarization around the world. We're seeing that especially in the US. So these issues seem to me that they're about to bite soon. And if you go locally in Australia, interest rates have spiked massively since May. Great for savers and retirees, but terrible for homeowners. And I suspect in 6 months' time, that's when you'll really see that bite as people's fixed loans mature and they end up on, on much higher rates than what they were paying 6 to 12 months ago. So you can see the clouds are there and they're gathering. It looks like global recession is very much on the cards. In fact, I'd say many economies are probably already in recession. So, yeah, very interesting times ahead.
About to bite soon, and as you say, it does appear that there are economies around the world that are in recession. Let's talk about the biggest economies. You were talking about Europe, and that's across many nations, but many of us will look at the US or even China. Economies, they actually do have an effect on our economy here. So we are actually, in some sense, affected quite dramatically by what else is happening in the world.
Oh, absolutely. The world is so globalised now. I mean, if you take China, for example, with Australia, that's 30% of our exports. And likewise, you walk into a Target or a Kmart, probably, I don't know what percentage it is, but it's an extremely high percentage of goods come from there. So when you get all these supply chain issues, Australia is going to get deeply impacted. But probably the biggest one, and the one Australia is very much affected by, is the US. And some people may have heard of the cliche that when the US catches a cold, when the US sneezes, the whole world catches a cold, I think is the correct one. And what we're seeing in the US is, it really is in recession. One of the largest companies in the world, Federal Express, which all of us will have used, who've had parcels delivered at our house from Federal Express, they announced a significant slump in their profits last week and closing down of, I think, close to 90 branches. And the reason being, though, was because they're seeing lower volumes of goods, transported around the world. So that's kind of like a warning sign of what's been going on. But I think what concerns me in the US now is it almost looks like a civil war at the political level, not at the, on the ground, but just politically. There's just utter hatred for the opposition is rising, and a number of Donald Trump's associates have been arrested over the last few weeks. And so you can see is a real, it looks like it's becoming a banana republic when you look at some of the behaviour going on there. And without wanting to sound cynical, America just passed this new legislation 2 weeks ago called the Inflation Reduction Act. And unfortunately, in this day and age, and I apologise for being cynical, often the name of a bill is the opposite to what actually occurs. Inflation reduction is something we all want, but you have to look at the underlying policies that make up that act. And one of them, in the case of the US, is forgiving student debt. But a number of independent economists have already come out and said, well, that's actually going to put more money in students' hands and people who have got this student debt, and therefore it's actually going to be inflationary. So it's actually going to do the opposite to what they're saying it's going to do. So, and of course, that means higher rates and even more break on the economy through higher interest rates. So you can see these sort of things playing out in real time and happening quite rapidly. So yeah.
So when when politicians are polarised, they can't get along. There's something that happens, and it's not so much the actual economy, but it's the confidence that people have that's affected. But when we're talking interest rates now, because this is where we often will say the Reserve Bank is juggling just how far to increase interest rates because they're trying to put the brakes on an overheating economy so that they can avoid a recession. But if they get it all wrong, then we'll be in recession too. How high do you think, Alex, our rates are likely to go before our economy slows to the point where that's what the Reserve Bank wants to do, to keep those inflationary rates, in the right range?
Well, central banks, in theory, they're independent, right? And so, in theory, they operate outside of, government or political influence. However, they're subject to similar sort of pressures, though. And central banks don't want to be blamed for inflation getting out of control. That's what they'd be very worried about. They don't want it to run riot for years and years. So it seems to me, and particularly the US Federal Reserve, is utterly determined to get the inflation rate down and are willing to do, whatever it takes, to use that expression, to bring it back down. So that suggests to me that if these inflation figures continue to rise, as they have been, then they're going to keep putting up rates until it breaks, if you like, and we then go into recession. So it seems to me they're literally hiking us into a recession, both overseas, but here in Australia as well. The Australian Reserve Bank will be nervous about house prices because that has a huge flow-on effect to the rest of the economy. So if they get it wrong and house prices fall much more than they expect, then I think you may then see them having to reverse course very quickly to try and, protect the housing market. Because what people forget about housing, even though my view is we need much cheaper housing in Australia, the reality is so many industries sit beside it, whether it's construction, whether it's retail, all those things are very much linked to the housing market and consumption. And so if they overdo it, you're going to see a very weak economy. And it's already tough. I've been travelling around Australia in the past 2 weeks, and I've seen all these empty retail stores and so forth because of the effects of COVID. So it's already challenging out there for small business owners as it is. And obviously it's going to bite households. Even though unemployment is low, households are going to find it hard if they've got a lot of debt. So,
not much time left. Let's just tackle some things quickly here. Alex, where do you see the property market heading from here, given those insights?
Yeah, so look, Sydney and Melbourne are already falling sharply. They're probably off close to 10% already for both those big markets. And you'd expect that because they were all already very, very inflated. Brisbane, though, is now finally starting to roll over. And many of the regional markets, though, have held up very nicely because there's still been that COVID response of people leaving. Now people want to work from home, so there's had that sort of push of people out of the cities into the regional areas. I suspect that will now slow down considerably, because I think those who are going to leave have probably done so. Maybe a few still more to go. But certainly those regional areas will start to weaken as well as interest rates rise, because at the end of the day, interest rates affect people's consumption, because if they're paying huge amounts of debt, that's going to have a flow-on effect. But the thing in the housing market that's more the concern is the rental crisis that we've got around the nation, where people just can't find rental properties. There's the lowest vacancy rates, I think, in recorded history at the moment. So that's a massive crisis in and of itself. And unfortunately, the Albanese government is actually going to worsen it, because they've said they're about to turn on the tap for more immigration into Australia. Now, generally speaking, immigration is a good thing, if you have steady immigration over time. But if you allow too many too soon, too quickly, then that's going to drive the rental crisis even higher. So that is a very serious risk. But they'll be keen to do that to keep propping up house prices, because rents will rise, which protects investors and so forth. So, probably the bigger concern, I think, is the commercial property market, because when you go around a lot of the CBD areas, it's still relatively quiet, especially on a Monday and a Friday. Companies are struggling to get their staff back into the offices. And so, you're seeing lots of vacancies in these cities. It's hard to believe that that's not going to bite. If I was a large company, you'd be looking at how do you, and many of them have been doing hot desking and things like that for years, but you'd be thinking to yourself, how can we reduce our office space over the next couple of years? Both A, as we go into recession, and B, as people don't want to return to work in an office as much as they did in the past. So,
volatile times ahead. And if you're asking that question, is chaos coming? Short of there being chaos, there'll certainly be a bite. Just to perhaps tie a loose end or two together and come back to what we do as we handle these sorts of thoughts as a Christian believer. I wonder, Alex, if you've got any thoughts, if people are worried about what's going on, what should they do? Any thoughts here?
Yeah, so I divide this into two key parts. And look, it's natural for people to worry, particularly when they hear commentary on the news and so forth. But I break it into two parts. One is the spiritual part, and the other is the practical part. The spiritual part is this, the Bible tells us that we'll all have tough times in our lives. We're not promised prosperity. And the Bible challenges us is, to take up our cross, to focus on Jesus, to run our race for him. And so, to one extent, Christians should try and switch off a lot of this noise. It's good to be aware and awake with what's going on. But the flip side is we need to focus on what God is calling us to do, step out in faith, and also to be generous in these things. So turn off the worry and turn on, what can I do to help others during this season as things get more challenging? And I think, I always say to people, I love reading God's word, and it's such an important time to reflect on God and who he is and his character, what he's actually like, and how powerful he is. We're talking about a God that's all-knowing, all-powerful, who can get us through these seasons. We don't need to worry. We have a supernatural God who's on our side who can get us through. So we need to think like that. We need to think biblically, and we need to spend the time with God. So we don't have this fear that the devil's trying to throw at us all the time. So that's the spiritual side of it, but then there's a practical side of it, and the practical side is just to take sensible steps to become a good steward with what God's put in your hands. Make sure you have control over your budgeting, okay? You've got to, know how you're spending your money. Look where you can cut back if you've got excesses. Look where you can save money. Look potentially to lock in rates if you're worried that you can't afford it if rates go too much higher from where they are today. Interestingly, I was chatting to a financial counsellor earlier this morning, and what he was telling me is that a lot of the states have basically it's like an energy saving policy whereby you can apply to the particular energy company that you use to have essentially partially government subsidised. Now, obviously, that's depending on your circumstance. It's depending on the state that you live in. But these are the things that people can look at to potentially bring their costs down if they're really struggling already. So there's lots of little things we can do, and just think practically. Don't be afraid to get help. The Bible says seek the counsel of others, whether it's a financial counsellor, a financial planner, or even people who are financially savvy. Get help. Don't be afraid to talk about it. Don't be afraid to ask, because there's lots of people out there who can help you. And we need to be helping each other and encouraging each other in this season, because I look at tough times as an opportunity for the gospel. We've got to get it out there. We've got to take advantage of the seasons that we're in so that we can win as many people for Jesus, irrespective of what's going on around us in the crazy world we find ourselves in.
Well, if chaos is coming, it may come to one household and not another. And as you say, Alex, there is help out there. Sometimes we need some level of support to know where to find that help. And as you say, there are financial counsellors, there are financial advisors who can help to deal with those issues. Alex Cook is the founder of Wealth with Purpose. You can connect with Alex at his website, wealthwithpurpose.com. All sorts of free resources on that website. You can follow Alex on Facebook and on Twitter. There's also an email address, askalex@wealthwithpurpose.com, if you have a question you'd like to have us address on this Tuesday regular update. Alex Cook, great getting your insights as always. Thanks so much for being with us once again today on 2020.
My pleasure, Neil. Thank you.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.